December 7, 1941, 7:55 a.m. The sky over Pearl Harbor erupts in fire. Explosions tear through battleships. Oil burns on the water. Men scream through the smoke as Japanese planes roar overhead. In less than 2 hours, the Pacific Fleet is crippled. The United States is at war. But as the flames fade and bodies are counted, another kind of battle begins, one fought in silence. January 1942, Pearl Harbor Naval Station. Beneath the rebuilt offices of the 14th Naval District, a locked steel door leads to a windowless room. Inside, the air smells of cigarettes and ink. Typewriters chatter. Radio static fills the background. Commander Joseph Rochefort leans over a sheet of 5-digit codes. His team, a dozen tired men in uniform, works without sleep. They aren't soldiers, they're codebreakers. Their mission isn't to fire back, it's to listen. Somewhere across the Pacific, the same Japanese fleet that destroyed Pearl Harbor is preparing to strike again. The messages are there, hidden inside endless numbers. One sequence keeps repeating. Rochefort circles it twice. He doesn't know it yet, but those 2 letters will decide the next great battle of the Pacific. The War of Machines is over. The War of Minds has begun. The Pacific in early 1942 was a map of red arrows and Japanese victories. From Hong Kong to the Philippines, one fortress after another had fallen. The Imperial Japanese Navy ruled the seas. Their aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had humiliated the United States at Pearl Harbor just weeks before. American ships still burned in the shallow waters of Oahu. Thousands were dead. Morale was shaken. The U.S. Navy had lost its sense of direction, both literally and strategically. Washington wanted revenge, but they had no eyes on the enemy. The Pacific was vast, and Japan's next target could be anywhere. Australia, Hawaii, or even the West Coast. Each day, new radio messages poured through static, encrypted, unreadable, mocking, but in a small basement beneath Pearl Harbor's 14th Naval District headquarters, something unusual was happening. Behind a locked steel door marked Station Hypo, a group of mathematicians, linguists, and naval officers worked in total secrecy. Their mission? To break JN-25, the Japanese Navy's main operational code. It wasn't just a cipher. It was a layered, complex system of code groups, 5-digit sequences that changed every few weeks. Each message looked like a random storm of numbers. To the untrained eye, it was meaningless. To Rochefort's men, it was the language of war. They had no computers, no modern tools. Everything was manual, paper, pencils, and logic. A single breakthrough could take days. A mistake could erase weeks of work. Still, progress came slowly. They began noticing patterns, repeated terms, and consistent signal sources. Each intercept told part of a story. Japanese logistics, carrier movements, and weather reports. Bit by bit, the team rebuilt fragments of Japan's invisible network. It wasn't enough yet to predict a major strike, but it was enough to prove one thing. Japan was planning something big. Back in Washington, few believed Station Hypo's progress was real. Intelligence officers at OP-20G, the Navy's main code-breaking unit, dismissed Rochefort as eccentric and unreliable. But Rochefort didn't care. He trusted his team more than bureaucracy. One clue kept returning in the decrypts. AF. It appeared again and again in logistics traffic. Fuel orders, provisions, air patrols. Somewhere in the Pacific, IF was being prepared for something massive. Rochefort didn't yet know what or where it was. But he knew AF would be the key to everything. In February 1942, the tension inside Station Hypo reached a breaking point. Each intercepted message brought them closer, but never close enough. The codebreakers were exhausted. They worked in shifts that blurred into each other, sleeping on cots beside the machines. Commander Joseph Rochefort led them with quiet focus. He was a cryptologist, linguist, and oddball. He often worked in a bathrobe and slippers, chain-smoking as he translated strings of numbers. His partner, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, was the intelligence officer for Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the Pacific Fleet. Together, they formed the bridge between raw information and battlefield action. Washington demanded proof, not theories. They wanted coordinates, fleet numbers, and dates. But with JN-25 partially cracked, Rochefort's team could only see fragments. Still, one word stood out: AF. By March, other decoded messages mentioned Operation MI. Supply ships were being rerouted. Air units were redeployed from Japan's interior. Radio operators noticed increased activity from Tokyo's combined fleet headquarters. Rochefort's instinct told him that AF was an island, a strategic one. But which? Some officers believed it was the Aleutians in Alaska. Others said Fiji. A few thought Hawaii again. But Rochefort and Layton focused on Midway Atoll, a small ring of sand and coral 1,300 miles northwest of Honolulu. Midway had little to offer, just an airstrip, fuel tanks, and a seaplane base. But to Japan, it could be the key to controlling the entire Central Pacific. In early May, tension spiked when U.S. intelligence intercepted messages ordering the destruction of AF's water distillation plant. Rochefort needed confirmation. He proposed a test. Nimitz approved it immediately. Midway's radio operators were ordered to send an open, unencrypted message stating that the island's water plant had broken down. Within hours, Japanese stations began transmitting that AF is short on water. The trap worked. AF was Midway. Now Rochefort knew where Japan would strike. The question was when Rochefort's decrypted fragments began to show fleet coordinates, dates, and weather details. He estimated the attack would come in early June. Nimitz made a bold decision to trust his codebreakers over traditional intelligence. He ordered his carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the recently repaired Yorktown, to position northeast of Midway, hidden beyond Japanese scouting range. The men at Station Hypo continued decoding, tracking every movement, every signal, feeding Nimitz updates in real time. For the first time in the Pacific War, the United States was not reacting. It was waiting. And at the center of it all, Rochefort's quiet war in the basement was about to change the course of history. Inside Station Hypo, exhaustion was normal. The men lived on coffee and cigarettes. They rarely saw sunlight. The room smelled of ink, sweat, and burnt tobacco. Most of them were in their 20s, trained in linguistics or math, but none had ever been this close to war. Their only weapons were pencils and brains. Commander Rochefort carried the burden quietly. He knew one wrong conclusion could cost thousands of lives. He worked long after everyone else had gone, rewriting decrypts, cross-checking call signs, and memorizing code groups. He barely spoke of his life outside the basement. His world had shrunk to one mission: find Japan's next move. The pressure was immense. Washington doubted them. Analysts at OP-20G accused Station Hypo of guessing, not proving. Rochefort didn't argue. He let the data speak. Every intercept that matched a real Japanese movement strengthened his belief. The men joked that they fought the war of numbers. Each breakthrough came with a strange mix of joy and guilt. They knew what their success meant. More Japanese ships sunk, more lives lost. Still, they understood the stakes. Every message they cracked could save American sailors, airmen, and civilians. Rochefort refused to let frustration break them. He reminded his team that the war would be won not just by guns, but by intellect. That belief kept them going, even when they didn't sleep for days. The technological angle-breaking JN-25 was like decoding chaos itself. The Japanese Navy used a super-enciphered code, 5-digit numbers grouped into words, then re-encoded with random additives. Each new edition of the codebook contained tens of thousands of code groups. When Japan changed editions, months of American work became useless overnight. Station Hypo operated with limited resources. There were no machines to automate analysis. Every intercept came from listening posts across the Pacific, in Hawaii, Australia, and the Aleutians. Messages arrived on rolls of paper. Analysts manually compared fragments, searching for repetition and context. They created massive crib sheets, noting which 5-digit patterns corresponded to ship names, weather terms, or logistics. It was slow, painful work. To the Japanese, their code was unbreakable. To Rochefort, no code was. He built his team around unconventional thinkers, mathematicians, crossword experts, even musicians, people who saw rhythm in randomness. Each day, the team updated their reconstruction of JN-25. Slowly, meaning began to surface. The word AF appeared alongside references to air units and supply lines. ME appeared in operational orders. Together, they hinted at something far larger than a raid. Rochefort realized the Japanese weren't preparing for defense. They were planning an offensive, a trap designed to lure the remaining American carriers into destruction. But what the Japanese didn't know was that their code was no longer secret. Admiral Chester Nimitz understood risk better than most. He had inherited a crippled fleet after Pearl Harbor, yet he carried himself with calm precision. When Rochefort told him that AF meant Midway, Nimitz didn't hesitate. He knew this was his chance to reverse Japan's momentum, but Nimitz also knew that trusting intelligence meant gambling everything. If Rochefort was wrong, the carriers would be out of position and Hawaii would be defenseless. If he was right, the U.S. Navy could deliver a blow Japan would never recover from. Nimitz played the long game. He positioned his 3 remaining carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the battle-damaged Yorktown, northeast of Midway. Hidden, silent, waiting. Their pilots didn't yet know what lay ahead. The Japanese believed the Americans had no idea where they were. That false confidence would cost them dearly. Every movement, every launch order, every false transmission was part of a calculated trap. Midway became bait. The Pacific its arena. Rochefort's intercepts continued to feed Nimitz with updates, fleet numbers, departure times, even target codes. By late May 1942, the puzzle was complete. Japan's powerful First Air Fleet under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was on the move. Its target was confirmed. Midway. The enemy's perspective to the Imperial Japanese Navy, Midway was the final step toward eliminating America as a Pacific threat. After Pearl Harbor, Admiral Yamamoto believed that another decisive battle could force the United States into peace negotiations. Japan's Navy still held overwhelming superiority. More carriers, better-trained pilots, and a longer reach. They viewed the Americans as disorganized and reactive. Their code, JN-25, had never been compromised before. No Japanese officer imagined it could be read. The attack on Midway, codenamed Operation MI, was designed as a perfect ambush. The plan called for a feint toward the Aleutians, to draw American attention north, while the main fleet would strike Midway from the west. Once the island's defenses were crushed, Japan would lure out the remaining U.S. carriers and destroy them. Yamamoto envisioned total control of the Central Pacific, with Midway as the outer ring of defense for Japan's empire. Confidence was absolute. Orders flowed smoothly, radio discipline was strict, and secrecy seemed intact. Japan's best pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea, were ready. What Yamamoto didn't know was that every signal, every movement, and every false code was already being read beneath Pearl Harbor. His perfect plan was already exposed. The Morro Angel Station Hypo's war was invisible, yet deeply human. Each message they cracked meant hundreds of lives altered or ended. Some in the room felt uneasy about celebrating success when they knew the cost. Others reminded themselves that Japan had struck first, killing thousands without warning at Pearl Harbor. Their mission wasn't revenge, it was balance. Every word decoded meant fewer American dead, fewer ships lost, fewer families broken. They understood they were not just reading numbers. They were changing the future, quietly, anonymously, without medals or headlines. When Rochefort finally reported that Japan would strike Midway on June 4, 1942, he didn't celebrate. He simply removed his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and told his men to rest. The real battle hadn't started yet. And soon their silent victory would unfold on the open sea. June 3, 1942. The Pacific Ocean was calm, almost deceptive. The horizon stretched endless and blue. Beneath that calm, two armadas closed in on each other, one blind, the other informed. Japan's massive fleet, led by Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, sailed confidently toward Midway. 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, formed the striking corps. They were escorted by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The operation was unfolding exactly as Yamamoto had planned. But Yamamoto didn't know that Admiral Nimitz already knew everything. Rochefort's intercepts had given him the exact date, direction, and composition of the Japanese force. The Americans were not surprised. They were waiting. At dawn, U.S. reconnaissance planes spotted the approaching fleet. The coded report, "Enemy sighted," reached Nimitz immediately. It was the moment Rochefort had predicted down to the day. On the morning of June 4th, the first Japanese wave took off to strike Midway. Bombers roared across the sea, hitting the island's airfield and fuel depots. The U.S. base burned, but its defenses held. Marine pilots scrambled into the sky, engaging the Japanese attackers in chaotic dogfights. From their carriers, the Japanese commanders believed the American fleet was still far away. They were wrong. Hidden to the northeast, Task Force 16 and Task Force 17, led by Admirals Spruance and Fletcher, were already launching their own aircraft. American torpedo squadrons went in first. Their attacks were desperate and costly. Most of the planes were shot down before reaching their targets. The few torpedoes that did hit failed to detonate. The sky was filled with smoke, tracer fire, and falling aircraft. But the sacrifice wasn't in vain. Those doomed torpedo squadrons had forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver wildly, disrupting their flight decks. At 10:22 a.m., the turning point came. American dive bombers from USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown, guided by luck and timing, found the Japanese carriers at the worst possible moment. Their decks were cluttered with refueling aircraft and bombs. In the span of 5 minutes, the U.S. Navy turned the tide of the Pacific War. 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were hit almost simultaneously. Bombs ripped through their decks, igniting aviation fuel and ammunition. Firestorms erupted, engulfing the ships in orange flame. Pilots who had just landed or were preparing to launch were trapped in infernos. From his flagship, Admiral Nagumo watched in disbelief as his fleet burned. His precision plan shattered in minutes. Communications broke down, flight decks became graves, and chaos spread through the formation. Rochefort's basement team in Hawaii didn't see the explosions, but they knew what was happening. The signal's traffic shifted. Japanese messages turned fragmented, panicked. Station Hypo had done its job. The silent war of numbers had turned into fire on the sea. The burning carriers of Japan's first air fleet sent pillars of smoke thousands of feet into the sky. The Pacific shimmered under the heat. Sailors leapt into the water as flames tore through steel and fuel. By late morning, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were gone, but the battle wasn't over. The remaining carrier, Hiryu, launched 2 counterstrikes in revenge. Her first wave located and struck USS Yorktown. Bombs slammed into the deck, ripping it open and leaving the carrier dead in the water. Her crew fought fires for hours, saving the ship long enough for aircraft to refuel and rearm. When the second Hiryu strike came, the damaged Yorktown couldn't maneuver. Torpedoes hit her broadside. The carrier listed heavily. Admiral Fletcher ordered the crew to abandon ship. Sailors slid down ropes into the oily water, watching the ship that had survived Coral Sea and Pearl Harbor finally die. But the Yorktown sacrifice gave the Americans time to locate Hiryu. At 5 p.m., dive bombers from USS Enterprise and Hornet struck back. Their bombs tore through Hiryu's flight deck, detonating fuel and ordnance. Within hours, she was an inferno. By nightfall, all 4 Japanese carriers lay burning beneath the Pacific. The pride of Japan's Navy, the same fleet that had attacked Pearl Harbor, was gone. Admiral Yamamoto, still hundreds of miles away with the main force, realized the disaster. His decisive battle had turned into a catastrophic defeat. He ordered a retreat. The Japanese fleet vanished into the night, leaving behind burning wreckage, oil slicks, and thousands of lost men. In Hawaii, Station Hypo received the final intercepts. Short, broken transmissions, distress calls, silence. Commander Rochefort removed his headphones and sat quietly. Around him, the room was still. No cheers, no celebration. Just relief. They had done it. Without firing a single shot, Admiral Nimitz sent a brief message to Washington. Pearl Harbor avenged. At that moment, the balance of power in the Pacific shifted forever. The United States had lost 1 carrier, while Japan had lost 4. The Imperial Navy would never fully recover. The war was far from over, but Midway changed everything. The codebreakers in the basement had turned intelligence into strategy, and strategy into victory. Now, as smoke drifted across the Pacific, a new kind of warfare had begun. One fought not just with ships or planes, but with information. When dawn broke over the Pacific on June 5, 1942, the ocean was a graveyard. Oil slicks spread for miles. Burned debris floated beside life rafts filled with exhausted Japanese sailors. Seagulls circled above. The smoke from the sunken carriers still hung like a ghost on the horizon. The Battle of Midway lasted barely 72 hours, yet it changed the direction of the entire war. Japan had entered the fight with 4 elite carriers and some of the best pilots in the world. All 4 were gone. Over 250 aircraft and more than 3,000 sailors were lost. The heart of the Imperial Navy, the same force that had humiliated the United States at Pearl Harbor, had been broken. For the U.S., the cost was painful but bearable. USS Yorktown and the destroyer Hammond were sunk. Around 300 American sailors and aviators were killed. But compared to Japan's losses, the trade was decisive. Admiral Nimitz described Midway as our most important victory since the beginning of the war. He was right. The psychological shift was enormous. Japan's aura of invincibility was gone. For the first time, its naval power had been shattered, and its expansion stopped. In Tokyo, the news was buried. Reports labeled Midway a minor setback. But within Japan's naval command, the truth was undeniable. Years of careful planning had been undone by a handful of codebreakers and the men who trusted them. Rochefort's team at Station Hypeo didn't receive medals or public credit. Their success remained classified. The official reports emphasized bravery and luck. But inside military circles, Nimitz and Leighton knew exactly who had made it possible. While the world celebrated the victory at Midway, the team in the basement simply kept working. JN-25 had already changed again. The Japanese were rebuilding their codebook. The race to read it would start all over. But for one brief moment, the silent soldiers of Station Hypo had done what few thought possible. They had turned knowledge into power, and that power had rewritten the map of the Pacific. In the months that followed Midway, the echoes of that victory reached far beyond the Pacific. Inside the Pentagon, analysts studied the battle's signals intelligence in detail. For the first time, Washington fully understood how much Station Hypo's work had changed the outcome. Yet recognition came slowly, and for Joseph Rochefort, not at all. Politics took over. In late 1942, senior officers in Washington, many of whom had doubted Hypo's findings, began to rewrite the story. They credited the victory to combined intelligence efforts, downplaying the role of the Pearl Harbor team. Rochefort, blunt and outspoken, made enemies among bureaucrats who valued rank over results. Without warning, he was reassigned. His reward for cracking Japan's naval code was a transfer to a dry dock project, inspecting ship hulls. He never complained. To him, the mission had always been about service, not fame. Meanwhile, the intelligence war deepened. Japan changed its codes repeatedly, trying to seal the cracks, but the momentum had shifted. Allied cryptographers now had experience, organization, and confidence. Station Hypeo's methods spread across the Pacific, inspiring new code-breaking units from Australia to Washington. Midway also reshaped naval strategy. The carrier, once seen as support for battleships, became the new king of warfare. Nations realized that intelligence, speed, and coordination mattered more than sheer numbers. Technology and information now dictated survival. Among the sailors and pilots who fought at Midway, the victory became a symbol of hope. After 6 months of defeat, they finally believed Japan could be stopped. The turning point wasn't only in the ocean, it was in the minds of men. Years later, historians would call it the battle that saved the Pacific, but to those who lived it, it was more personal. It was proof that discipline, intellect, and courage could triumph even in the darkest moments. Rochefort's contribution remained classified until decades later. In 1985, 43 years after the battle, the U.S. government finally recognized his leadership with the Navy Distinguished Service Medal. By then, Rochefort was long gone. His legacy lived quietly in the archives and the faded pages of decoded messages that had once held the fate of nations. The victory at Midway belonged to many. Pilots, sailors, admirals, but its foundation was built in silence, by a few men in a basement who listened, calculated, and never gave up. Their war had no glory, only truth. Midway was more than a battle. It was a turning point in how wars would be fought. For centuries, victory belonged to those with bigger guns or larger fleets. After 1942, it belonged to those who could see first, think faster, and act smarter. The Codebreakers of Station Hypo never fired a shot, yet their fingerprints are on every American victory that followed. Their quiet minds turned information into strategy, and strategy into survival. Their story also revealed something deeper, that heroism doesn't always wear a uniform or stand on a deck. Sometimes it hides in silence, surrounded by paper, pencils, and tired eyes. The men of Station Hypo didn't chase glory. They chased understanding. They believed that truth itself could be a weapon, sharper than any blade, stronger than any bomb. And at Midway, that belief changed the world. The Pacific War would rage for 3 more brutal years. But from that moment on, Japan would fight on the defensive. The tide had turned, not through luck, but through intellect. In the end, history remembers the burning carriers and the pilots who fell. But beneath it all, the victory began in a quiet basement in Hawaii, where numbers became meaning and meaning became power.